So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this PLSA Policy Insights webinar on pensions manifestos, what they tell us about the next government. My name is James Walsh, Head of Membership Engagement here at the PLSA. Great to have you all on board this morning. We had just over 190 people, I believe, registered for this, so a great group of our members today. We've had a poll running in the last few hours or so on our new member area, which I hope you're all making good use of. And the poll was asking whether you've read any of the manifestos. And from what I saw of results, some people had read manifestos, very few hadn't paid any attention to them. But the most popular option was, yes, I've read some of the pensions relevant parts of the manifesto. So we'll see what my colleagues have to tell you about that tallies with your own reading. So we've got two of my colleagues joining us today, and I'm going to ask them to very briefly introduce themselves, starting with my colleague, Joe Dabrowski. Good morning, Joe.
Morning, James. Morning, everyone. I'm Joe Dabrowski. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy here at the PLSA and keen to hear your views on manifestos, our recommendations, and all things in between.
Super. Thanks, Joe. And we've also got my colleague, Katy Little. Hi, Katy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katy, and I'm Head of Parliamentary and Stakeholder Affairs at the PLSA, and I have definitely read all of the manifestos.
Great stuff. Thanks, Katy. We're looking forward to hearing from you later. So the plan for the next 40-odd minutes is we're going to first hear from Joe, who's going to talk about a paper that we put together here at the PLSA and what we'd like to see the next government do in its first 100 days on pensions issues. We'll have time for a couple of questions to Joe, so do put your questions in the Q&A box or comments in the chat. I'll be scanning those throughout. Don't wait for the end. I'll be weaving plenty of questions in from you. Then we'll hear from Katy about the different parties' manifestos, what they say on pensions, and a bit about how we go about building links with the policymakers, and we'll have time for some questions to Katy, and then more time for more questions from you towards the end. Just by way of background, in our online member area, we've now got a general election hub full of useful material about pensions and the election, so do please have a look at that. And I think there's a link to it in the chat, certainly a link to the poll that I mentioned. So that's the plan for this morning, and we're going to kick off with Joe talking about the first 100 days and what we want to see. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, everyone, for your time this morning. So I think we all probably recognise that an incoming government or even a continuing government will have a whole host of priorities and things to be getting on with. And the timing of the election means that we'll probably be into parliamentary recess over the summer pretty quickly too. So the chance to get things going quickly and to think about broad issues and pensions issues is going to be maybe off to a slightly slow start. And we know that Labour has also committed to potentially doing a pensions review, which we'll probably talk a little bit about later. Nonetheless, we think there are a number of areas where the government could make a good, fast start by focusing on some particular pensions issues and things that they can move forward with, which we think will make a difference across the sector and in particular to savers. Now, a kind of a headline point, those are kind of up on screen. So DC decumulation, supporting members at retirement, better DC, in particular, trying to make some progress on tackling the adequacy challenge that, research that we put out with our 5 steps to better pensions, it demonstrates that maybe 50% of people are not on track to receive an adequate pension in the future against those pension commission targets. So we need to do something quickly about that rather than sort of kicking the can constantly down the road. The future of DB, where we've seen a number of consultations at the beginning of this year about what DB might look like. Also seeing big changes in DB funding over the last 18 months, prompting other questions, including questions around the public sector consolidator. And of course, we're all eagerly waiting on the final DB funding code from the pensions regulator, which will really set out the agenda for DB funding for the next 5 to 10 years. So important issues to grapple with. Pensions and growth, we know, is not going to go away as an issue for any government coming in. They are looking at institutional capital and how it can support both the economy and deliver good outcomes for savers. We've had a lot of engagement with current government and the opposition over the last year about these issues, and we think there are some key ways that they can address our needs in a way that suits us and the savers. And of course, the future state of the LGPS and what that might look like in terms of governance, structure, and other things is going to be of vital importance and a live debate, because the minister, one of his final acts was to write to LGPS funds asking them to write back by the 19th of July. Well, that sort of didn't quite pan out. Might be somebody different receiving the answers now, but explaining how they're running, how they're delivering value for money, and whether consolidation might be a better solution in the future. So lots of big things, and we've got some recommendations about how to address that. And we'll start maybe just diving into DC decumulation as the first issue. So for a long time, PLSA has been pushing on DC decumulation. We think members need more support at retirement, and clearly regulators have caught up with that, and they consulted earlier this year on proposals that were quite close to our guided retirement income choices, which would introduce a statutory duty for trustees to support members with support and guidance and options at retirement. And we look at the kind of chart here, there's a lot of questions that people need to work through. And clearly, most investors, most savers are not sophisticated enough to be dealing with these by themselves. And they are at risk of various elements that were really brought to the fore with freedom and choice. As more people save into DC and come to retirement, we think it's essential that we kind of address this issue. So we're hopeful that a new government could pick up where the last one left off. That DC decumulation proposal is essentially nearly done. So getting that out the door, out the stocks and into the statute books pretty quickly would lead to a fairly big change in the at-retirement market in short order, and which would really deliver extra support and help for savers. So we're keen, and we think this is a pretty straightforward win for any incoming government to pick up and run with. So lots of hopes around DC decumulation, and I think that can be done quickly. So next, we'll probably look at how to improve DC. And we'll move the slide on. So supporting, as I mentioned, addressing the adequacy challenge is really one of the big issues that we face as a sector, as a society, quite frankly. And so we were very supportive of the private members bill that went through during the course of last year, introducing that AE 2017. 2017, wow, it's quite a long time, isn't it, to get this done? So those recommendations kind of bringing more people into AE. So the legislation is there, the secondary just needs to be brought through. We know that that can be done reasonably quickly if the will and attention is there. So bringing that forward for us is an important first step in that next stage of enhancing AE. Moreover, we really need to see this roadmap for increasing contributions to get up to a level of 12% by the mid-30s. We know that savers and employers need that roadmap to think about when the changes are going to come through, how it impacts their costs, their business, and other things. And that clear planning that we saw in the introduction of AE needs to happen for the next phase. So we're keen. We think it can be done. There's a universal consensus across the pension sector, and more broadly, I think now you see it from employer groups and other groups, recognizing that AE contributions need to rise. Otherwise, we are going to face a future problem. Separately, the employment bill, which was part of the Conservative Party manifesto in the last election, and which Labour have also committed to bringing forward, we would like to see that brought forward reasonably quickly. We think that can also address some of the questions around gig economy workers who sort of sit halfway in, halfway out sometimes of pension provision, and reclassifying them fully would give more people the chance to get a pension in retirement and through their entire career, rather than being left kind of on the outside for now. So a couple of steps. We think these can be done reasonably quickly, and we think there's a lot of consensus around these issues too. So hopeful that these could be progressed forward. I talked a little bit about DB at the beginning, so just kind of dipping into some of those DB issues where we've seen a lot of conversation over the last few months. If we just move the slide along. So clearly DB is in pretty rude health at the moment. Isn't necessarily always the case, so we need to be careful about that, but it also does, we know, provide savers with a great pension, and those who have DB, our analysis shows, do tend to perform better on our adequacy measures over time. So we've been waiting on the DB funding code. It's been a long time coming. We think it's important that the final version ensures that flexibility for schemes, in particular flexibility for open schemes to carry more risk in their investment outlook, and also think about the long term rather than getting into short-term funding cycle issues. And ensuring that that works is going to be vital for us. We're keen to see that come through, but of course, with the delays in the expected publication, the implementation of the funding code needs to be on a reasonable timeframe. I think that needs to shift the timeframe back from the kind of September, October ambition that came through earlier in the year, probably to the end of the year or into early 25, to be realistic, to allow people to see what it looks like and have a conversation about it. That might mean some tweaks to the regs or some fudges around it that kick in September. Super funds, we know DWP is supportive, Treasury is supportive. Ministers have made various supporting statements in budgets and everything else more recently. It's been a long time coming. We need to get this super fund regime legislation kind of settled and out there and allow this really to kind of kick on. But it's important that those levels of protection are included in the next regime too. But keen to see that move forward. There is a lot of support for it, so let's get it going. The surplus release, we've had consultations earlier this year. We think with the right protections, it would be sensible to introduce some options to allow surplus to be extracted and to be used for enhancing benefits. Could be DC, could be DB, R&D, or other things that may be generally useful. So we think a lot of things that can be done fairly quickly in this space too, and things that will give DB schemes comfort about their situation and also give employers a clear way forward too. Touching on pensions and growth next, the issues of how we align the needs of pension funds and the needs of the government and the UK for extra investment are kind of going to be critical and are not going to go away. We've seen elements of this in the Labour's Growth Fund, Mansion House Compact from the Conservative government, and a range of other issues. So we've got a lot of interest in making this happen and making sure that our fiduciary duties are protected, but also we get some extra choices about how we might want to invest and be supported from any new government. And we think the appetite is there. It does feel like the appetite is there. But first of all, we need to see the value for money framework that DWP, TPR and FCA have been working on come through. We'd like to see the alignment between the DWP and the FCA elements really sorted. We think FCA is sort of leading on that, but we think actually a full alignment would be a better way to go, and across the market implementation, including retail to start with, would be more beneficial than starting in one place and adding others on later. That does really lead to potential risks of disaggregation and different approaches. We are working on a pipeline of assets report presently, which will publish probably in the next month or so. And we're looking at how do we get this kind of partnership working between government and industry. You know, how do we set up a system which the pipeline of opportunities that we might want to invest in is supported by government through a combination of fiscal incentives, structural changes, regulatory changes, or simply tidying up some of the government machinery, which does have a lot of different bodies doing a lot of similar things in this space and trying to have a conversation with pension funds. So we think there is a real opportunities to make this work, to get the alignment right. But first and foremost, protecting, ensuring fiduciary duty is respected and upheld is our starting point. And very quickly move on to the LGPS. So the LGPS, hidden giant really amongst UK pension funds, often forgotten by those of us who maybe spend most of our time in the private sector, but a scheme which has got nearly 7 million members, manages over 400 billion worth of assets, and has 15,000 plus employers participating in it. One of the biggest funds in the world. But there are some long-standing issues in relation to kind of what does the governance of the scheme look like? How do some of the recommendations of the good governance report that was pushed forward by the Scheme Advisory Board following an ask from DLUP, that sat with DLUP for a fair bit, partly because of endless changes in ministers and some of the questions and squeezes about resources and timing of political cycles. But for us, moving this forward, given the size of the scheme, the importance of making sure the governance works and unlocking some of that potential is really essential. So we're very keen that those recommendations, which have been sat on ministers' desks for almost 2 years now, I think, are progressed forward quickly, and that will move us into the next phase of LGPS operation and fluency. And obviously, we've had a big change in local councillors who sit on pensions committees over the last few months too. So getting that all up and running and working as smoothly as possible is going to be essential. So that's a pretty rapid fire tour through some of those recommendations. Please read the report. It's a little bit longer, but happy to pick up any questions.
Well, thanks, Joe. That's great to see that very comprehensive vision for what we want the next government to do, and great that you and colleagues are going to be putting that to whoever's going to be in charge. You've sparked off quite a few questions. And incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, do put your questions in the questions box. I can see a couple of it have dropped into the chat, which is fine. I'll pick them up from there. But the Q&A box really is the place. So let's kick off, Joe, with a challenging one for you from an anonymous delegate who says PLSA seems to be anti-collective CDC, or at least don't seem to recognise its role. Surely this ought to be recognised in your pensions future as a sensible and efficient solution to address both DC adequacy and decumulation challenges, and it aligns also with consolidation. So come on, Joe, are we ignoring CDC?
No, we're not ignoring CDC. So I should probably be clear that these are steps that would be introduced fairly quickly. There are a whole raft of other things that we'd want government to be thinking about over the kind of mid and longer term, and CDC and both decumulation and potentially accumulation is going to be part of that. I think we're still relatively early days in the scoping of CDC. We're waiting on CDC multi-employer scheme regulations. We're waiting to see how the first CDC scheme that Royal Mail are looking to implement will work. And there's a lot of work going on across the industry, which we're plugged into in terms of developing the proposition and how it might work, and also how it might work for potentially schemes that want to transition from DB to CDC rather than from DC to multi-employer CDC or other reasons. So lots of activity going on that. My colleague Rory, if anybody wants to reach out to him via the member platform or the website, he is all over all things CDC. So do get in touch if you've got more interest in it.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're absolutely right. Rory Grant in our policy team, I know he's our man on CDC, so definitely not anti or ignoring, but it's a good question and a good challenge. Matthew Webb asks about decumulation. Does the PLSA support the flex and fix idea? This should be suggested or championed by the PLSA and read better DC as well as the auto-enrollment changes that we need for adequacy. Does the PLSA support the save more tomorrow idea, which works very effectively in the US? Joe, any comments on those propositions?
So I think the flex and fix,
If you can say it.
Proposition works. It is quite interesting. We have our own decumulation proposals, which, I mean, there's a degree of commonality. I mean, they're perfectly reasonable. I think the way that DBP is going is looking a little bit closer to our guided retirement income choices proposals than flex and fix, but it's still early days. Save more tomorrow. I'm not 100% sure how it works, but happy to pick up separately. If it may be a little bit similar to some other proposals that I've seen here in the UK, but more detail I'm happy to pick up.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Joe. So we've got a few more questions just in the chat there, and we'll come back to those. But let's stand you down, give you a rest for a moment, Joe, and let's bring Katy in. So Katy, you've been looking particularly carefully at the manifestos. What have you found?
Yeah. So last week, the main parties, political parties published their manifestos. So I'm going to give you hopefully an overview of the main pensions related announcements in them, and a little bit of insight into what else we might expect in terms of pensions policy from whoever forms the next government. So I'm going to start with the Conservative manifesto. So that was launched Tuesday last week at Silverstone. And in terms of pensions, we see it mentioned 11 times in total throughout the manifesto. But the main focus where we see it coming up is in relation to the state pension. So I think one of the biggest Conservative pledges is this commitment to the triple lock plus policy. So this will guarantee that both the state pension and the tax-free allowance for pensioners will always rise with the highest of inflation earnings, or 2.5%. And this is so that the new state pension doesn't get dragged into income tax. In addition to this, they promised to maintain all current pensioner benefits. So this includes things like free bus passes, winter fuel payments, free prescriptions, and also TV licenses. At the PLSA, we've been sort of consistently supportive of the triple lock policy. You know, the value of the state pension and the role that it plays in making up, you know, a key part of savers' incomes is really, really important when we talk about things like adequacy and also, you know, our retirement living standards. So it's good to see. There's also a really big commitment from the Conservatives to a new pensions tax guarantee. So they've pledged not to introduce any new taxes on pensions. So they're going to maintain the 25% tax-free lump sum. They're also going to maintain tax relief on pension contributions at their marginal rate. And they're not going to extend NI either to employer pension contributions. So there's quite a lot of focus on tax, both for pensions and beyond in the manifesto, I would say. I think it's quite clearly something the Conservatives see as like a key part of their offering to the electorate and part of their campaign this year. In terms of other notable areas, they've also promised to implement the Mansion House reforms and then also build on the Edinburgh reforms. They were sort of announced and have been sort of in tow over the past year. It feeds into this sort of pensions and growth narrative that Joe mentioned earlier. You know, how do we get more institutional investment into the UK economy and pension funds going forward? I think given the importance of growth in the economy and, you know, the economy very much being a real focal discussion point of this election, might have expected to see a little bit more detail in the manifesto where these policies are heading. I think that being said, we can probably take a pretty good stab at where they're going to pick up various policies. So, for example, we've had a lot around consolidation, so the value for money proposals, the public sector consolidator proposals as well, also the LGPS, even though these things aren't explicitly called out in the manifesto. Moving on to the next slide, we also see commitments from the Conservative Party to reintroduce the boycott, sanctions and divestment bill. So this bill was actually dropped when Parliament ended just before the election. It's something that we've been working on quite a lot at the PLSA, and it's of concern to our LGPS members. It was a 2019 manifesto commitment as well, and we've seen it sort of transferred into this manifesto too. We also see the Conservatives talking a little bit about net zero and ESG matters. They tend to talk about it in terms of, you know, a pragmatic and affordable transition to net zero. So specifically, we've got a commitment in there to create an integrated procurement model to make defence procurement faster by aligning ESG considerations with investment in the defence industry. Given the geopolitics of this, I think it's probably quite an important one to call out. And then finally, we've also got a shout out to the recent Wolseley judgment and a promise to review that further. And I think that's it in terms of pensions policy from the Conservatives. So I'm going to move swiftly on to Labour. So Labour, we see pensions mentioned 16 times and mainly in relation to growth. So we know that one of Labour's key commitments has been to achieve the highest sustained growth in the G7. So that's usually the context in which we see pensions policy mentioned. In fact, only yesterday we saw Labour pledge to hold an investment summit in its first 100 days of government. So it really, really is a priority for them. We see clear commitments in there to adopt reforms to ensure that workplace pension schemes take advantage of consolidation and scale, also to deliver better returns for savers and greater investment in UK PLC. We also see a commitment from Labour to establish a national wealth fund, which Joe's already mentioned. They say it's going to be capitalised with £7.3 million, and it will be used to support things like clean energy infrastructure. And I would say a lot of these growth policies aren't really a surprise. So earlier in the year, Labour published a financing growth paper. And in that paper, it sort of linked some of these commitments with things like carrying on the value for money work, pushing further things on like LGPS pooling as well. So there's actually quite a lot of cross-party consensus in this area, and whoever gets in, we're not going to see that pensions and growth narrative go away. I think one of the most interesting things to come out of the manifesto, though, was this pensions review. So I think the wording around this is really, really important as well. So it says it's going to consider what further steps are needed to improve pension outcomes, as well as increasing investment in UK markets. So if the polls are correct and we do end up with a Labour government, I think a key thing for us at the PLSA will be influencing what's in that pensions review. I think it's really important that it looks at some of the other policy areas we've got going on in terms of adequacy, as well as the investment piece, which is sort of at the forefront of everyone's political thinking at the moment. We've also seen that Labour will commit to bring forward an employment bill. That's been outlined in their deal for working people, that's what they call it. We would like to see this brought forward in a way so that more workers are brought into the scope of AE, as Joe's already mentioned. And then on to the next slide, fantastic. We see a commitment from Labour again on retaining the triple lock. However, we've got some stronger lines on things like ESG and net zero. And what I mean by that is there's lines in there that mandate UK regulated financial institutions, including pension funds, to develop and implement credible transition plans that align with the Paris Agreement. And then last but certainly not least, we also want to see, or they've pledged a commitment to the mine workers pension scheme as well. So I don't think there's anything hugely surprising in there, but what I would want to sort of pull out, which isn't in there, is conversations around the lifetime allowance. Now, that doesn't feature in the manifesto, but it's certainly been a topic of discussion in the media recently. They've publicly said that they won't reintroduce it, but it's not in the manifesto, and that's worth bearing in mind. And then last but not least, the Liberal Democrat manifesto as well. So we see, oh, this next slide. Fab, thank you. We see a lot more focus on things like net zero and ESG in the Lib Dem manifesto. It's always been sort of a really key priority, I would say, for the Liberal Democrats. We always see them focusing on this particular policy area. So we've seen that they've pledged to introduce a requirement for pension funds to demonstrate that their investments are consistent and in line with the Paris Agreement. We also see a little bit of pensions and growth in there, so expanding the role of the British Business Bank to help facilitate private investment into the UK, again with a particular focus on investing in things like carbon neutral, the transition to net zero, green infrastructure, those types of things. We also, the PLSA has published its own pensions and growth paper. We actually have a recommendation in there about having closer relationships with the British Business Bank and having a role for them in terms of finding suitable projects and linking them up with sort of pension fund needs as well. So it's good to see it there. We also see a triple lock commitment. So all three of the major parties have committed to pledging the triple lock moving forward. And then finally, there's also a nod to adequacy in there. So there is a commitment to tackle the pensions gender gap. And sort of this is the only time we see this particular issue mentioned in any of the manifestos. They also call out specifically a commitment to ensure that gig economy workers don't lose out on pensions, which is again very close to our asks in our 100-day document, which Joe's previously just run through. So they've also promised as well to bring forward a commission for older people and ageing. So hopefully that's a brief counter through sort of the main parties' manifestos. I think I'm going to hand back over to you, James, for some further questions.
Thanks, Katy. Yeah, an excellent canter and plenty there. And you and Joe sparking off plenty of questions. We'll come to those very quickly. But just a quick one, Katy. You focused obviously there on the three main UK-wide parties. But what about, is there anything you want to say about, say, the SNP or Reform?
Yeah. So the sorry, James. The SNP haven't yet released their manifesto, unfortunately, but Reform did theirs yesterday, and obviously they're doing rather well in the polls as far as we can tell. Interestingly, I thought there was nothing on the triple lock in there. So I think if I was a betting woman, I would have suspected there might be something around the state pension, but there isn't. They did, however, say that they're going to do a pensions review as well. I think sort of the same requirements we'd have for the Labour pensions review as well. So to make sure it looks at adequacy, some of those other pension policy areas, as well as the investment side of things. Interestingly, they've also got or suggest a new ownership model for critical national infrastructure. So the idea is that they would bring in 50% of each utility into public ownership, and then the other 50% would be owned by UK pension funds. I think sort of in our pensions and growth work, sort of one of our red lines is that, you know, pension funds exist to invest in the best interest of their members. So not massive fans of mandation, I would say, but there's not a great lot of detail on how that might work in practice, but it's interesting to see. The Greens have also launched their manifesto as well. You can probably take an educated guess about where some of their policies are aimed, but they do have requirements for UK pension funds to remove fossil fuels and from their investment portfolios and their balance sheets by 2030. There's no triple lock commitment in the Green Manifesto, but they do commit to raising the state pension by inflation. And then there's also quite an interesting tax proposal on the Greens as well. So they would equate the rate of pensions tax relief with the basic rate of income tax to help fund social care. So I think there's probably some questions around that in terms of how we also look at pensions tax relief at the PLSA, whether it's fair, whether it's equitable, and whether it reaches the criteria that we've, you know, previously specified in terms of how we would like to see pensions tax relief reformed.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Katie. That's great. Well, let's turn quickly to the questions because there's quite a few of them. And first couple I see are on sort of tax issues. Katie, maybe you could have a bash at these. So Rob Durbin says, as long as I've been working in pensions, 25 years. Well done, Rob. There's a recurring rumour, and we know where this is going, that higher rate tax relief and over 25% tax-free lump sum will be abolished as a revenue raising measure. And Rob, you're absolutely right. This is always rumoured, every budget, every fiscal statement. Given the black hole, he says, in all party spending commitments, what chance do you think that something will change this time around? Katie?
First of all, I agree. Sort of whenever we have budgets, it's always sort of speculation in the papers about a removal of high rate relief. I think it's something that's really quite hard to do politically, though. And, you know, I think Labour also have sort of a pledge in there to, you know, if they get in, to have a look at tax policy. So you might see it caught up in, you know, some of those reviews that they do around tax policy. I think it's quite politically hard to do, though. So I don't know, maybe they're going to have to pull some levers, I think, when they get into government, though. So it'd be interesting to see which ones they do.
Thanks. And I think you've sort of answered this, but Tim Smith, who of course was one of our commentators in our last webinar on the lifetime allowance, Tim's asking, how much comfort can we take from the fact Labour Party didn't say anything about reintroducing the LTA in its manifesto? Does this mean they've dropped the idea, or might they still reintroduce it? I think you said, Katie, they have now said publicly they won't reintroduce it. How solid do you think that is?
I think there's probably a timing issue to consider here as well. So it's obviously been in the news quite a lot, and I would imagine it's a public commitment that might have come too late for the manifesto, or they didn't quite get it in. That being said, it's not in the manifesto, and the stuff that's not there, it might suggest that, you know, the further down the line, sort of a couple of governments later, they might think about it as well. So, you know, manifestos, it's always what is there and what isn't there. And I think it's probably notable that it's not in there as a hard commitment.
Okay, fine. So we might not have to bring Tim back for a third appearance in a PLSA webinar on lifetime allowance, which I'm sure be a great relief to him. Thanks for that, Tim. Let's just perhaps now turn back to Joe, and let's work through some of these questions we've got. I can see one there lurking in the chat from let's say Shakaran, who's asking about self-employed people. Joe, a big policy question there. And the question is, how can we make sure self-employed people have adequate pensions, brackets, harder to bring within auto-enrollment, which is true. What are your thoughts on that? And what might we say to the next government about self-employed?
Thanks, James. I think it is a real tough question. I think also the nature of how we consider self-employed people has changed quite a lot over the last 5 to 10 years, as some of those gig economy workers who described being brought in under an employment bill would be classified as self-employed today, but maybe not in future. and also the kind of the range of workers is very different. I think we do need to do more. I think it is quite difficult to kind of build a model that brings self-employed people into occupational pension schemes, but there may be wrappers that we can think about, and how we deliver that, which is beyond and better than the kind of current ISA model. I also think probably recognizing that people have quite different work patterns, so they might be self-employed for a period and then employed, and how do we allow people to kind of integrate some of those options into kind of maybe one or two kind of longer term products that work for them. I think it is a big challenge. We don't have any great solid complete answers as a sector for this at the moment, I think, but it is something we'll have to address.
Thanks, Joe. And still on a sort of auto-enrollment theme, I suppose, we've got a question. Do you expect the expansion of AE and moves towards 12% to be part of Labour's pensions review, or might they be implemented separately and more quickly? Joe, do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I suspect not more quickly. I think Labour has been quite careful about avoiding talking about policy changes that could be perceived as increasing costs on business, certainly in the short term. They also don't have a shadow pensions minister in place, and a new pensions minister would have to get up to speed on some of the issues. So it doesn't feel like a short-term thing, but I think if it's included in the pensions review and the pensions review is completed reasonably quickly, actually, I don't think that's such a bad thing, because it does mean that there is a kind of settled policy position and consensus. Government would have looked at the issues, the costs, and hopefully the review would have made a recommendation about a kind of roadmap for change and increases, which could then be implemented more quickly, rather than maybe kind of going round the houses for another 2 to 3 years without much progress. It could be the catalyst for the progress that we do really, really need to make on this issue.
Just while we're on that,
those AE regs could be brought forward more quickly. Those ones that I mentioned earlier, you could do that in 3 months if you wanted.
Yeah. I'll come back to the questions for the audience in just a moment. But Katy, perhaps I could just ask you, how are we going to go about as the PLSA developing relationships with the new government? Whatever form it takes. What's your plan for that?
Yeah, well, we're obviously going to have sort of a new swathe of MPs, so we've got some work ongoing at the moment in terms of putting together briefing packs for them, telling them a little bit about, who we are as a PLSA, what we think are the important policy priorities. We're also looking about trying to get a bit of regional data to slip into those to try and make pensions as attractive as possible, and try and establish some relationships with sort of the new incoming. Also got in tow letters to all the new ministers, so that includes our key departments, including HMT, DWP, and also DLUC. Getting in early and having those intro meetings with those new faces is going to be really, really important. We're doing a bit of work with the departments at the moment in terms of what's going to be on the table, what would we like to see. If you're going to put something in front of a new minister, what would you like to see happen? And then obviously we've also got some work with select committees as well. So the select committees are now dissolved. We're going to have new chairs of the select committees. We might have new members on the select committees as well. So talking to the new chairs, talking to the secretariat of the committees as well, and doing a little bit of an education piece around there too. So there's lots going on in the public affairs space, I would say, post 4th of July too.
Time for you, Katy, I'm sure, but all really interesting stuff and important for representing our members to policymakers. So let's get back to the specifics. And Katy, this might be one for you from Michael Burton, who says Labour are silent on the Economic Activity Overseas Matters Bill and its manifesto. Do you feel this is something the party feels strongly about and might seek to reintroduce? I know this is particularly important for our colleagues in the LGPS and other schemes too.
Yeah. So I don't think they're going to be pushing that forward. It's been a Conservative sort of pledge in the last few manifestos, but we haven't seen it crop up in Labour circles. I think Labour probably really want to get out the stocks quite quickly and pursue the things they've got going on in growth. I just think they'll have bigger priorities when they come into government. I think the politics of it makes it slightly difficult as well. So it's a sensitive subject too.
Yeah, sure, you're right. Thank you. And then Ben Stafford says, hi, thanks both for good summaries. Thanks, Ben, for your nice comments. And he's got a question to Joe on DB option stroke consolidation. Do you have any sense of what Labour's priorities would be for surplus access and the public sector consolidator, should they get a majority? Any difference from Sunak's government's direction of travel on that, Joe?
Yeah, I think a Labour government would instinctively be fairly supportive of a public sector consolidator. There are a couple of checks on that, though. It is absolutely the case that unions have always been concerned about employers being able to, for want of better words, kind of walk away from pension promises on the cheap, and they have had concerns about past proposals to allow the transfer of funds to the pension protection fund, kind of where people have been struggling. So I think there's some kind of checks and balances around the issue. There isn't, we're kind of fairly early stages of the public sector consolidated debate, the kind of evidence for the cost benefit analysis and whether it works and if there is a market failure or not, hasn't really been established. So I suspect this isn't an issue that will kind of, you need primary legislation, you need other big changes. It doesn't feel like it will be top of their agenda to start with, but I think intrinsically it does slightly appeal to them. Surplus access, I feel, is an issue that parties will look at with a degree of support if the surplus can be put to productive uses. I think Labour is much less likely to be willing to allow surpluses to be extracted to be then paid as dividends to shareholders or to exec bonuses. So I think there might be some different kind of caveats put around how surplus access might be perceived or allowed.
Can I just quickly ask those
Yeah,
questions? Answer, I should say as well. In the financing growth paper that I mentioned that Labour published as well, they said a little bit around DC consolidation. They also said a little bit about LGPS consolidation, but DB consolidation wasn't mentioned in that paper. So I think it's an area that they're probably going to have to do a little bit of thinking about, as opposed to that they've got sort of hard set, fast policies sort of ready to go on this area.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you. And perhaps while we're on that theme, we've got one or two questions about sort of climate change, sustainability issues. So Matthew Zimmerman asks, how are you interpreting Labour's wording re the Paris alignment? Are we likely to see an effort to directly influence asset allocations in pension schemes? And Lasaya also asks in the chat, will the pipeline of assets paper address the need for investment in assets to support the climate transition? So Katie, do you want to sort of comment on that set of issues?
Well, I might hand over to Joe. Actually.
I might want
Yeah,
Joe.
that's
Okay,
probably more my bag, James. But so the pipeline of assets paper is looking at the climate change investment opportunity, the need in the UK, and the areas that might work well for UK pension funds to invest in. So yes, picking that up. I think we've seen a little bit of a cooling on climate commitments from the present government over the last kind of 18 months as they kind of focused on other areas. I think we're likely to see Labour engage in that space much more. I don't think we'll see mandation, but I think you might see, as was described in Katie's summary, a little bit more like we do already with the kind of TCFD and net zero commitments and the climate change modelling. A little bit of sharper edges around that. Okay, what do transition plans look like? How are you investing? What are you doing? How is this being measured? Of course, we need the green taxonomy. We need some of the reporting to come through on underlying companies, managers, and the ratings all to be sorted. So there's a lot of work to be done to make that as seamless as possible.
Thanks, Joe. And we're very nearly at time, but we just got one last question we haven't answered. And Joe, I'm going to ask you to try and unfairly ask you to give a one-sentence answer to a massive question from Marcus Evans. With the state pension in general and triple lock in particular becoming increasingly expensive, does the PLSA have a view on how this can be resolved? Could it be partly funded by cutting high rate tax relief? Joe, any quick thoughts?
So I don't think it'll be funded by cutting higher rate tax relief. We support the triple lock from now. Certainly, most people rely on the state pension as their primary source of retirement income. So we need to make sure that works. We'd like to see it kind of match up with the minimum level of the retirement living standards. The state pension review is going to be one of the first items a new government picks up on its to-do list since it was kicked over a parliament by the present government. Whether the costs are as much given changes in longevity, COVID impacts and other things, we'll have to see. But I think we'll eventually see changes, but probably not for a few years.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe, and thank you also to Katy. Thanks both of you. We've ranged over a huge amount there, and no doubt more we could discuss. And indeed, we've got our next webinar on the 16th of July, which is going to focus on pensions and growth. So picking up some of the issues we've covered today. No doubt they will have moved on by then, and there'll be plenty more for us to get our teeth into. We'll put that a date in your diary, 16th of July at 11 o'clock. You can also find more useful material on the election and pensions in the General Election Hub in our online member-only area that's been up and running for just a few weeks now. So some good stuff there. Have a look at that. Don't forget, today is the last day to register to vote. If you haven't done so, you've got till just before midnight. And to answer David Whitaker's question earlier, which I should have said at the start, yes, slides and recording from this will be circulated to all of you. I think that's it. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to everyone who's dialed in and sent us so many great questions. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the day.